Good morning, everybody. Today, I would like to talk a little bit about anti-Asian racism in the United States. And just to clarify, when I say anti-Asian racism, I am referring to Eastern and Southeastern Asians, most prominently the Chinese and the Japanese. Today, we are excluding those of Indian or Middle Eastern descent because they deserve a lesson of their own. But I want you to know that just because they aren't part of today's discussion doesn't mean they are not also affected by racism. They are. Alright, let's start. The history of Asian Americans is as old as America itself, but we see a large influx of Asian migrants during the middle of the 19th century, when namely many Chinese people fled their own country to find a new home in the New World. China was going through a tough time. There were many conflicts within the exploding population, and poverty was a growing issue. Thousands moved to the US in order to find work in a place where their family could live in peace. The Chinese were known for being hard workers who didn't demand as much money as the Americans. That made them the perfect candidates for the project of building a railroad that connected the relatively recently settled California to the, at the time, much more established state of Utah. Over 20,000 Chinese workers were involved with the construction of this railroad. And for a short time, things were looking good for Chinese immigrants. But as these things tend to go, a large growth of a minority population which is perceived as outsiders, the tides changed rather quickly. Here is where we first see anti-Asian propaganda pop up in the United States. Political posters like this one were common and gave those white people who lived in poverty and without prospects an attainable enemy to hate that wasn't their government. As we have seen in modern-day racism, the feelings haven't really changed all that much in the last 200 years. Fear is always a powerful motivator, and it is what charged anti-Asian sentiments back then as well. The Chinese were accused of taking away jobs from real Americans by demanding less money than seemed adequate. They were blamed for a rise in drug consumption, mainly opium during those times, as well as the rapid spread of smallpox. And, as always, they posed a grave danger to the innocent, defenseless white women and children. Sound familiar? It should, because the rhetoric also hasn't really changed over time. But it is just as effective as it was back then. You've probably read or heard this quote by Donald Trump, the former President of the United States, before. And yes, as always, our enlightened piece of home we call Europe is obviously not out of the woods either. Well, as you can imagine, where journalists and political opinion makers become loud enough, official policies follow closely behind. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act is passed, meaning that immigration from China specifically is banned, with the exception of highly educated academics. In 1924, that immigration ban is widened to now contain all of the Orient, as is declared, in order to include other East Asians. After that, Asian Americans experience an unprecedented rise in racism. In 1927, the Supreme Court passes a law that officially denominates Asian Americans as people of color. That way, Asian American children can legally be forced out of whites-only schools, and Asian Americans can be forced into legal ghettos, places we now know as Chinatowns, where to this day a large portion of inhabitants is of Asian descent. At the same time, those laws made it illegal for an Asian American to marry a white person or to be present in whites-only spaces. This law affected every aspect of a person's life, from housing to education to job opportunities and personal relationships. Racism was everywhere, and now it was supported by the law. And then Pearl Harbor happened. In 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service attacked an American Navy base in Honolulu during a surprise military strike. Up to this moment, the US had been a neutral country in the most destructive war the world had ever seen. The strike was meant to preemptively debilitate the US Navy to stop them from interfering with military coups that the Japanese Empire was planning in the Southeast Asian area. But while the attack itself was devastating, over 2,000 Americans died that day, it didn't have the desired effect. On the contrary, the surprising nature of the attack on a non-enemy country, as well as the lack of a prior warning or declaration of war, turned what was meant as a disarming move on America into a reason for the US to get involved in the war. Pearl Harbor became a symbol to the Americans, similar to the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center 60 years later. It was often used in pro-war propaganda, and every Japanese American was now seen as the enemy. In 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the infamous Executive Order 9066, which declared that all people of Japanese descent were to be locked into internment camps. Over 10,000 Japanese Americans were uprooted and locked into camps under devastating circumstances. These camps resemble an eerie familiarity with internment camps we know from Nazi Germany. By May of 1945, Germany had surrendered, and the Allies focused their energy on Japan. Their efforts cheered on by an enthusiastic and optimistic population. Incidentally, only 2 months later, in July of the same year, a group of scientists who have worked on the so-called Manhattan Project for years now finished the development of a weapon that is more destructive than anything the human race has ever seen before or after it. The atomic bomb. Eager to keep the pro-war mob motivated, the US drops 2 atomic bombs over Japan in August of 1945. The cities Hiroshima and Nagasaki are obliterated. Hundreds of thousands of mainly civilians are killed. All the while, the propaganda machine works hard to justify such a level of hitherto unprecedented destruction. Japan had no choice but to surrender, and by September 1945, World War II officially came to an end. Up to this day, one of the most devastating chapters of human history that took over 75 million lives, a large majority of them civilians. In December of the same year, the Japanese internment camps were quietly closed, and the atrocities that may have taken place there were largely swept under the rug in order to preserve America's self-image. It took until 1952 for Asian Americans to be re-recognized as equal human beings by US law, and slowly but surely the country saw its first Asian American congressman, its first Asian American NFL quarterback, and its first Asian American astronaut. And in 1983, an elected commission officially investigated the Japanese internment camps, coming to the conclusion that they could not have been justified as a wartime necessity. Now, this sounds like things were finally looking up for Asian Americans, doesn't it? Unfortunately, by the 1980s, Asia had mostly recovered from World War II, and the Japanese car industry was on the rise in the US. I think by now you can guess what happened. If your guess was more anti-Asian propaganda surmounting in unfounded violence against people who have objectively nothing to do with the problem, you guessed correctly. Japanese cars were cheaper and more efficient than their American counterparts, and therefore gained immense popularity during the late 20th century. Because of that, American workers in the suffering car industry felt that their jobs were unfairly taken away from them, resulting in violent outbursts that first targeted Japanese cars and subsequently people who looked Japanese. The most high-profile case is that of Vincent Chin, a 27-year-old man who celebrated his bachelor party in Detroit on the night of June 19, 1982. He was attacked and brutally beaten to death by two white auto workers who felt that their jobs might be in jeopardy because of the growing presence of Japanese cars in the industry. The fact that Chin was of Chinese descent, not Japanese, played no factor in the attack. Both men were released with a fine of only $3,000, the judge reasoning that they weren't the kind of men you send to jail. This marks a critical point for the Asian American community, who were understandably outraged over this verdict. People rallied in the streets, protesting and carrying banners with Vincent Chin's last words, whispered seconds before he lost consciousness forever, prominently displayed. It's not fair. The result was the signature of Ronald Reagan on a Civil Liberties Act, which officially acknowledged the Japanese internment camps as unlawful and issuing reparations of $20,000 to each victim. But because the law only recognized living survivors with natural citizenship, the pool of potential recipients was small. In the end, around 150 people of Japanese descent received $5,000 each before funds ran out. In 1990, George H. W. Bush marked the month of May as Asian History Month. It would take almost another 20 years until Judy Chu is elected as the first Chinese American Congresswoman. And only in 2020, Kamala Harris becomes the first Asian American and the first woman to be sworn into the office of Vice President. Unfortunately, 2020 is also the year in which the coronavirus outbreak takes over the entire globe. China is quickly pointed out as the point of origin, and the Chinese government's efforts to play down the actual numbers causes international outrage. Yet again, we see a dramatic rise in anti-Asian hate crimes, which spike during the summer of 2020. As well as anti-Asian sentiment. Once again, fear is the driving factor, which still works remarkably well. And countless politicians are all too ready to use this fear in order to get the angry mob on their side. This short and not at all complete overview of anti-Asian racism in the US, as well as the fact that Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, as it is called nowadays, is just around the corner, leave us with one question. What now? How do we break this cycle that seems to repeat over and over and over again? Can we even break it? Or are we doomed to see history repeat itself, unable to change anything? Well, as you can imagine, the answer is obviously not this simple. Otherwise, we probably already would have changed something. But I would like to show you one take by the legendary civil rights activist Dolores Huerta. She gave a TED Talk in 2019 called How to End Racism. Let's have a look, shall we? While we watch, please take some notes about her main points.
I would like to talk about something that is really causing a lot of destruction in our society, that is hurting many, many people, that affects how our resources are distributed, and many people whose futures are really maimed and destroyed. And that is racism. And actually, there's very one simple way that we can get rid of racism. And it's a scientific explanation about our human origins. We are actually only one human family. We have a lot of different ethnic groups, we have a lot of different cultures, we have a lot of different nationalities, but we only have one human race, Homo sapiens sapien. And we just have to remind people where our human race began. Our human race began in Africa. And as Homo sapiens traveled across the planet, they went to Asia, came down to the Bering Strait to the Americas, and people got a little lighter in skin. Well, one of our tribes ended up in Europe, where it's very cold, and they commingled with the Neanderthals, and they lost their color. So now, those folks have to go to the beach to get their color back, or to the tanning salon. So it is so important that we remember that we are all one human family. And so we can say to all of those white nationalists, get over it, you're Africans, okay? Just get over it. And we know that the racism has been really sharply targeted to Latinos. And I just want to say to everybody, Google the map of the United States of America before 1848. And when you see that map of the United States of America, you're going to be shocked, because guess what? A third of the United States was Mexico. So when they tell us, go back where you came from, we have to say to them, you know, we are where we came from, okay? We were here before the border. So we didn't cross the border crossed us. We were here before the border. And so then we extend those attacks against Latinos, and then we think of all of the people that are in cages at the border. All of these people that have come to seek refuge, asylum seekers in the United States of America. And we think, well, why are they coming here? I mean, we go to those places like Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. We go there as tourists. So why are they leaving their beautiful lands to come here? Well, we know a lot of it is due to poverty. And then we think of the word bananas. Bananas? Yes. How many bananas do we consume in the United States every single day? Does that money go to the people in Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduras. No, the money that we spend on bananas goes to Chiquita Banana, to Dole Banana, to the 50 banana companies, and it never reaches the people on whose land the bananas are produced or the people that work to produce the bananas. So this is something that we have to think about in terms of our foreign relations. And then we punish the people who we have exploited to make our banana corporations rich. And we know that this is wrong. So we have to do something about this. And Coretta Scott King said this: we will never have peace in the world until feminists take power. So this is what we have to work on. But to do that, we've got to get rid of another evil that we have in our society, which Helen Keller said is the worst one that scientists have never been able to find a cure for. And that is apathy. So that means that all of us then have to become organizers. We've got to go out there. We've got to talk to our friends. We've got to talk to our relatives. We've got to talk to our neighbors and say to them, please join us. Please help us organize so we can get rid of the racism and the bigotry, the misogyny, the homophobia, thinking about our environment and how we have to save our planet. And we could all do this, but that means that we've got to get out there and we've got to get to work and make sure that all of our public institutions, our private institutions, every single organization, that they will join us in this movement to get rid of racism, sexism, homophobia, bigotry against our labor unions, against our working people. But if all of us work together, we can actually make it happen. So I'm going to ask you all a question, and I think you know the answer. And the question I'm going to ask you is, who's got the power? Now, wait a second, okay? I'm going to ask you who's got the power. I want you to say, we've got the power. And when I say, what kind of power? I want you to say, people power. Can we do that? Yeah. Okay, let's go. Who's got the power? We got the power. What kind of power? People power. So all of us working together, can we make sure that we end the racism? Can we do that? Yes. Okay, the bigotry, the misogyny, the homophobia, okay, and save our planet. Okay, so let's all do it all together with an organized hand clap, and we'll say it in Spanish. Yes, we can, which means sí se puede. Let's go, all together. Sí se puede. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Well, now that you've seen her stance on the issue, I would like for you to take some notes about your opinion, just so that you'll be able to comment on the question, how do we break the cycle of racism, in tomorrow's video conference, where we will talk about the issue a little further. Maybe you have some ideas that we could implement in our everyday life. If you can't think of anything, that's no problem. Please prepare a short comment about Dolores Huerta's TED Talk. Do you agree or disagree with her, and why? With that, I wish you a wonderful rest of the day. I'm looking forward to hearing your opinions about this topic. I hope you took something new away from today's video lesson, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye!